Keep moving, recruits! No pauses! Push through! Or fail! Keep moving, recruits! No pauses! Push through! Or fail! Keep moving, recruits! No pauses! Push through! Or fail!
60 of the galaxy's most elite recruits walked into the Crucible. 59 were crushed by gravity, hunted by apex predators, and broken by psychological terror. Then there was the human girl. While the universe's toughest warriors screamed for extraction, she looked at the instructor and asked, "When do we start?" The dropship bay smelled of ionized ozone, synthetic hydraulic fluid, and the palpable suffocating stench of fear. 60 recruits stood in tight, perfectly aligned formations on the graded deck of the Aegis Vanguard transport vessel. They were the absolute apex of their respective sectors. There was Sullivan, a 9-foot-tall reptilian bruiser whose species naturally possessed dermal plating thick enough to deflect small arms fire. Beside him stood Carter, an arachnid mammalian hybrid with 4 arms and a nervous system so fast it made standard motion trackers glitch. Then there was Jenkins, a silicon-based behemoth who looked like a walking geological formation. Every single one of them had been given standardized Western call signs to integrate into the Coalition's universal translation matrix. It made communication seamless, but it did nothing to bridge the biological gaps between them. And then standing in the back row was Abigail Lawson. She was 54. Her skin was soft, completely devoid of scales, kitten, or neuroctive camouflage. She wore a standard-issue tactical uniform made of synthetic poly-blend fibers. Her brown hair tied back in a messy bun. Compared to the hulking titans around her, she looked like a stiff breeze would shatter her spine. From the observation deck above, Director Hayes stared down through the reinforced glass, his hands clasped behind his back. Beside him, Overseer Mitchell was furiously tapping at a data pad, calibrating the Lockheed Martin BM monitors embedded in the recruit suits. "I still don't understand how the Coalition allowed a primate into the Vanguard selection," Mitchell muttered, his pale, elongated fingers dancing across the console. "Sector 4 didn't even have faster-than-light travel until a decade ago. Now they're sending us this." Hayes didn't blink. The political brass wants representation from the fringe worlds, a show of unity. But Vanguard Command doesn't compromise on standards. The Crucible will weed her out in the first 3 minutes. "We just need to make sure the medical drones extract her before her internal organs liquefy." Mitchell snorted. "If the gravity doesn't crush her, the atmospheric toxicity will, setting parameters for Class 9 Deathworld simulation now." Down in the bay, the overhead lights slammed from sterile white to a harsh flashing crimson. The dropship's ramp began to lower with a deafening metallic shriek, revealing the barren, desolate landscape of the training zone known only as the Crucible. "Listen up, recruits," Director Hayes' voice boomed over the localized PA system, the bass vibrating through the deck plates. "You have been selected because your respective militaries believe you are the elite. You are the strongest, the fastest, and the most lethal operators your planets have to offer. But the Vanguard does not care about your past. Out there is the Crucible. It is a synthesized environment designed to replicate the most hostile biomes in the known galaxy." Sullivan cracked his massive knuckles, letting out a low, rumbling hiss. Carter shifted on his 4 legs, his mandibles clicking in anticipation. "You will endure 1.2 times the standard galactic gravity," Hayes continued. "The atmosphere contains microtoxins and a reduced oxygen density that will suffocate the weak. The temperature will fluctuate violently. Your objective is simple: survive and reach the extraction point 15 mi north. If you fall, you fail. Drop." The magnetic locks disengaged. The recruits surged forward, rushing down the ramp into the howling wind of the Crucible. Abigail adjusted the straps on her 50 lb rucksack, took a deep breath, and jogged out. The moment their boots hit the soil, the reality of the Crucible slammed into them. The localized gravity field generators kicked in instantly, adding 20% more weight to every cell in their bodies. To the right, a squad of Avon-descended recruits immediately collapsed. their hollow bones and fragile musculature screaming under the sudden oppression of 1.2 GS. They hit the dirt, gasping, unable to lift their heads. The automated medical drone swooped down within seconds, flashing red failure lights. 10 down, Abigail thought, stepping over a groaning Avon. Jenkins, the silicon giant, was trudging forward, but his movements were sluggish. The high gravity wasn't his main issue. It was the atmosphere. The scrubbers were pulling oxygen from the air, simulating an elevation of roughly 10,000 FT above sea level. Jenkins's massive frame required immense amounts of oxygen to power his silicate muscle servos. He was already wheezing, his gray skin turning a sickly shade of ash. Abigail, on the other hand, just blinked. She rolled her shoulders, feeling the weight of the rucksack. 1.2 GS, she calculated mentally. It was definitely heavier than Earth, but Earth's baseline gravity was already considered highly anomalous by galactic standards. Most of the Coalition's core worlds hovered around 0.6 to 0.8 GS to allow for massive, sprawling alien anatomies to develop. For Abby, an ultramarathoner who had spent 3 years working high-altitude search and rescue for a private contractor based out of the Colorado Rockies, this wasn't crushing. It felt like wearing a slightly heavy winter coat, and the air, it was crisp. A bit thin, sure, like a morning run in Leadville, but nothing that made her lungs burn. She settled into a steady, rhythmic jog. Her breathing was measured, inhaling through the nose, exhaling through the mouth. Up in the observation booth, Mitchell's jaw practically unhinged. "Director," Mitchell whispered frantically, tapping his screen. "Look at the telemetry on the human." Hayes frowned, leaning over the console. "What is it? Is her BO monitor malfunctioning?" "No, sir. Look at her heart rate. It's sitting at a steady 85 beats per minute. Her blood oxygenation is at 98%. She's jogging." Sir Hayes narrowed his eyes, watching the live feed. Out in the desolate gray landscape, alien recruits were dropping to their knees, vomiting from vertigo or clutching their chests as their cardiovascular systems failed. And right through the middle of the carnage, Abigail Lawson was jogging at a brisk, unbroken pace, her arms pumping in perfect symmetry. "Increase the gravity," Hayes ordered coldly. "Bump it to 1.5. Let's see how much her joints can take before they snap." The ground beneath Abigail's boots suddenly felt like it was made of molasses. The invisible hand of the artificial gravity pressed down harder, turning her 50 lb rucksack into a 75 lb anchor around her. The effect was catastrophic. Carter, the four-armed, agile fighter who had been leading the pack, suddenly let out a high-pitched shriek. 2 of his legs buckled under the immense pressure. His species relied on speed and agility, evolving on a low-mass moon. At 1.5 GS, his internal fluids were being dragged down into his lower extremities, depriving his dual brains of oxygen. He collapsed, convulsing violently before a medical drone hovered over him, shooting a stasis field to save his life. Sullivan, the reptilian bruiser, was one of the few still moving. He was practically crawling, using his massive clawed hands to drag his heavy-plated body forward. He looked over his shoulder, his slit pupils widening in absolute disbelief. Abigail was still upright. She wasn't jogging anymore. She had slowed to a tactical, purposeful hike. Her face was flushed, a sheen of sweat gathering on her forehead, but her posture was flawless. Spine straight, center of gravity over her hips, utilizing the mechanical advantage of her skeletal structure, just as human persistence hunters had done for hundreds of thousands of years. "Hey," Abby said casually as she passed Sullivan, "pace yourself. Don't fight the weight. Let your skeletal structure hold it. Breathe in for 3 steps, out for 2. Sullivan just stared at her, his jaw slack, a string of thick saliva hanging from his fangs. "How are you standing, flesh thing?" he gasped out, his chest heaving like a bellows. "I grew up on Earth," Abby replied, offering a brief, sympathetic smile. "My dad used to make me carry 50 lb bags of water softener, salt up 2 flights of stairs when I was 10. You'll get used to it, just keep moving." She walked past him, leaving the galaxy's most terrifying apex predator staring at her back in existential dread. In the command center, Hayes slammed his fist onto the console. "This is impossible," Hayes barked, pulling up the structural scans of the human anatomy. Look at her. She has no exoskeleton, no redundant organs. Her musculoskeletal system is comprised of calcified tissue and water. At 1.5 gs, her spine should be compressing to the point of paralysis. Sir, Mitchell stammered, his eyes wide. I just pulled the Johns Hopkins Xenobiology report on humanity. I don't think we read the brief properly. Earth's baseline gravity is 98 of standard. She's only experiencing a 50% increase in weight. To her, this is equivalent to rigorous strength training. Hayes stared at the screen, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. Gasps and sighs. What about the air? The toxins? Humans ingest localized biological neurotoxins for recreation. Sir, snorts caffeine, ethanol, capsaicin. The atmospheric scrubbers are currently cycling microparticulate of sulfur and thin oxygen. Our sensors indicate her respiratory system is simply filtering it out like standard environmental smog. She lived in a place called Los Angeles for 2 years. She actually seems to be breathing easier than baseline. Enough, Hayes hissed. The Crucible is meant to break them. Activate Phase 2. Drop the temperature and release the stalk. Out in the field, the sky darkened instantly. The localized weather controllers ripped the heat out of the air, plunging the temperature from a mild 20 degrees C down to a bone-chilling -15. Frost immediately began to form on the rocks. For the cold-blooded species like Sullivan, it was a death sentence. His metabolism plummeted. He let out a pathetic groan, his massive body shivering uncontrollably before he fell face first into the dirt, entirely immobilized by the cold. Abigail stopped. She looked at Sullivan, then looked up at the gray, swirling sky. A biting wind whipped across her face, stinging her cheeks. She reached into her rucksack and pulled out a standard-issue fleece-lined beanie, pulling it over her ears. She zipped her tactical jacket up to her chin, shoved her hands into her pockets for a brief moment to warm her fingers, and then kept walking. Minnesota winters, she muttered to herself, her breath forming white clouds in the air. At least there's no sleet. Suddenly, a low mechanical growl echoed from the rocky ridges ahead. 4 stalkers emerged from the simulated fog. They were biomechanical constructs designed by Boston Dynamics' off-world military division, meant to simulate the apex predators of the galaxy's deadliest worlds. They resembled massive metallic wolves with hydraulic jaws capable of snapping a titanium rod in half. They were programmed to target the stragglers, forcing recruits into panic and testing their combat reflexes under severe exhaustion. The stalkers bounded down the ridge, moving with terrifying speed despite the high gravity. They locked their optical sensors onto Abigail, who was now completely alone in the center of the valley. In the booth, Mitchell covered his face. Sir, pull them back. She has no kinetic barriers. They'll tear her apart. Let's see what the primate does when she's hunted, Hayes said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Down in the frost-covered valley, Abigail didn't run. She knew that running from a predator triggered a chase response. Instead, she stopped, widened her stance, and reached down to unzip the standard-issue tungsten baton from her belt. With a flick of her wrist, the baton extended with a sharp crack. The lead stalker lunged, its metallic jaws snapping wide to crush her shoulder. Abigail didn't try to overpower it. She had spent years doing aikido and judo. She understood momentum better than a supercomput. As the 300 lb machine leaped at her, she sidestepped with fluid grace, pivoting on her heel. She used the machine's own forward velocity combined with the 1.5 g gravitational pull against it. She brought the tungsten baton down hard right at the joint connecting its hydraulic neck to its chassis. The impact, fueled by earthborne dense muscle fibers, shattered the optical relay. The stalker slammed face first into the dirt, its momentum sending it tumbling violently over the rocks until it sparked and went dead. The other 3 stalkers skidded to a halt. Their programming matrix was suddenly confused. The algorithm dictated that prey either ran or died. It did not calculate that the soft, fleshy biped would expertly weaponize gravity to break a class. 4 combat drone in a single strike. Abigail spun the baton in her hand, taking a deep breath of the freezing air, her eyes locking onto the remaining machines. She let out a sharp, aggressive shout, stepping toward them. The Stalker's threat assessment processors flashed from yellow to red. Calculating a high probability of structural damage, the drones tucked their hydraulic tails and scrambled back up the ridge, retreating into the fog. Abigail sighed, collapsing the baton and clipping it back to her belt. Must be on the lowest difficulty setting, she mumbled, adjusting her beanie. By hour 4, the Crucible was a graveyard of defeated Titans. Of the 60 recruits that had dropped, 59 were currently sitting in the medical bay of the Aegis Vanguard, wrapped in thermal blankets, hooked up to oxygen respirators and nursing bruised egos. Sullivan was staring blankly at the wall, questioning his entire evolutionary lineage. Carter was in a mild coma. Jenkins required a localized pressure tent just to keep his silicon lattice from fracturing. Up in the observation command center, there was absolute pin-drop silence. Director Hayes and Overseer Mitchell were standing inches from the main holographic display, their eyes unblinking, their breathing shallow. On the screen, Abigail Lawson was scaling the final incline. Phase 3 was supposed to be the executioner. It was a steep 60 degrees rocky incline leading to the extraction bunker, battered by simulated hurricane-force winds blowing at 80 mph. The gravity had been bumped to 1.7 gs. Abigail was crawling, but she was moving. Her hands, devoid of claws or suction pads, found the tiniest fissures in the simulated rock. Her boots dug into the dirt. Every time a massive gust of wind threatened to peel her off the face of the cliff, she flattened. Her body pressing her center of mass against the stone, holding on with a grip strength that defied biological logic. Human hands were an evolutionary marvel. They weren't meant for crushing armor. They were meant for tool use, for holding, for enduring. Just like climbing El Capitan, Abby thought, her muscles screaming, lactic acid burning through her veins like liquid fire. Don't look down. 3 points of contact. Breathe. Her knuckles were bleeding, the frost biting into her exposed skin, but her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated human stubbornness. "She's not stopping," Mitchell whispered, his voice trembling. "Director, her muscle fibers are micro-tearing. Her joint cartilage is under extreme stress. But her brain is overriding the pain signals. She is flooding her own system with a localized chemical cocktail of adrenaline, cortisol, and endorphins. She is essentially drugging herself into a state of temporary invulnerability." Hayes couldn't speak. He was looking at a creature that had evolved on a planet where nature constantly tried to kill its inhabitants. Earth had earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, blizzards, venomous predators, and invisible pathogens. Humanity hadn't survived by being the strongest or the fastest. They survived by being the most relentlessly, terrifyingly resilient things in the universe. On the screen, Abigail pulled herself over the ledge. She rolled onto her back on the flat summit, gasping for air, the hurricane winds howling around her. She lay there for a full minute, her chest heaving, the red warning lights of her BM monitor finally beginning to blink. Then slowly, agonizingly, she rolled onto her stomach, pushed herself up to her knees, and stood. She dusted the frost off her pants, winced at the pain in her bleeding knuckles, and limped toward the heavy reinforced steel doors of the extraction bunker. She pressed her hand against the biometric scanner. The heavy doors hissed open, revealing a sterile, brightly lit waiting room. Behind a wall of 4 in thick ballistic glass stood Director Hayes and Overseer Mitchell, their faces pale, staring at her as if she were a ghost. Abigail stepped into the room. The gravity here was normalized back to 0, 8 gs, and the air was rich with perfect oxygen. She stumbled slightly, feeling incredibly light, almost dizzy from the sudden lack of resistance. She walked up to the ballistic glass, looking at the 2 alien commanders in their immaculate uniforms. She noticed they were staring at her, completely speechless. She also noticed that the room was entirely empty. No Sullivan, no Carter, no Jenkins. Abby frowned, pulling off her beanie and wiping a streak of half-frozen sweat from her forehead. She leaned against the glass, tapping on the localized intercom button. "Excuse me, directors." Abi's voice crackled through the speakers in the command center, breathless but calm. Hayes swallowed hard, pressing the receiver button. "Yes, Recruit Lawson." Abby looked around the empty room again, a look of genuine confusion crossing her face. "Is this the waiting room?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "I'm sorry if I took a little longer on that last hill, but when does the actual training begin?" The silence in the observation command center was so absolute that Director Hayes could hear the hum of the overhead ventilation fans. Overseer Mitchell's hands hovered frozen over his data pad. Down in the extraction bunker, Abigail Lawson was still waiting for an answer. She shifted her weight from one leg to the other, wincing slightly as the adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind the dull ache of torn muscles and bruised ribs. Hayes leaned heavily on the console, his voice barely a whisper when he finally pressed the intercom key. "Recruit Lawson, that was the Crucible. There is no further training module. You are the sole remaining active candidate." Abigail blinked. She looked back at the heavy steel doors she had just crawled through, then up at the reinforced glass. "Wait," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the empty room. "You mean the rest of my squad? They all failed already." "They were medically evacuated to prevent multi-organ failure," Hayes replied mechanically. "You are to proceed down the corridor to Medical Bay 4 for a full physiological debriefing." 30 minutes later, Abigail was sitting on the edge of an examination table, sipping from a foil pouch of electrolyte fluid. Her tactical jacket was off, revealing the bruises blossoming across her arms and shoulders. The medical bay was a scene of controlled chaos. To her left, behind a transparent partition, Jenkins was submerged in a gelatinous stasis tank, his silicon structure slowly rebonding under ultraviolet lasers. To her right, Carter was strapped to a ventilator, a team of synthetic nurses monitoring his shattered nervous system. Standing in front of Abigail was Dr. Leonard Pierce, the Coalition's chief xenobiologist and one of the few humans permanent. NTLY stationed on the Aegis Vanguard. Beside him stood Overseer Mitchell, who was staring at Abigail's readouts on a Siemens Health's orbital bioscanner as if the machine were actively lying to him. "I need you to explain this to me, Doctor," Mitchell said, his elongated face pale. Her muscular tissues suffered catastrophic microlacerations. Her system is flooded with lactic acid, a known toxic byproduct of anaerobic respiration. By all known galactic biometrics, she should be in a coma, yet her cells are repairing themselves. Dr. Pierce chuckled, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Overseer, you're looking at a species that evolved as pursuit predators. Early humans used to run down prey for days until the animal simply collapsed from exhaustion and heat stroke. Lactic acid isn't poison to her. It's a signaling molecule. It tells her body to adapt to build the muscle back denser and stronger. As for the micro-tears, that's literally how humans gain physical strength." Mitchell looked horrified. "They destroy their own bodies to make them stronger." "Pretty much," Abigail chimed in, tossing her empty electrolyte pouch into a nearby biobin. "It's called hypertrophy. Honestly, I've had worse soreness after leg day back in Denver. Are we going to get some real food soon? I'm starving." Mitchell took a step back. "Your metabolic furnace burned through 6,000 calories in 4 hours. You should be cannibalizing your own organs for energy. We store kinetic energy in adipose tissue," Pice explained patiently. "She could probably go another 3 weeks without food if she had access to water. But yes, let's get her some protein." A low, rumbling groan interrupted them. From the recovery caught across the aisle, Sullivan slowly sat up. The massive reptilian warrior looked battered. His thick dermal plating was cracked in several places from where the localized gravity had slammed him into the rocks, and his golden-slit pupils were dilated with exhaustion. He locked eyes with Abigail. The human girl sitting on the exam table didn't flinch. She just offered him a small, polite nod. Sullivan slowly pushed himself off the cot, ignoring the frantic beeping of his medical monitors. He towered over her, 9 FT of lethal muscle and armor. Mitchell tensed, reaching for a sidearm, but Dr. Pierce held up a hand. Sullivan stopped 2 feet away from Abigail. He looked at her small, unarmored hands, noting the dried blood on her knuckles from where she had scaled the final cliff face. "I am Sullivan of the Draconus Expanse," he rumbled, his voice like grinding tectonic plates. "My ancestors conquered 7 worlds. My scales can turn a plasma bolt." He paused, lowering his massive head until he was eye level with her. And yet when the gravity crushed my spine and the cold stopped my heart, you walked past me. You defeated the metal beasts with a stick. You climbed the mountain of death. Sullivan brought his massive fist to his chest, bowing deeply. I do not know what hell world forged your kind flesh thing, but you are a demon of endurance. You have my absolute respect. Abigail smiled, a genuine, warm expression that completely disarmed the terrifying alien warlord. Abigail Lawson, she said, holding out a hand. And the hell world is called Earth. You actually did pretty well out there, Sullivan. With a little high-altitude conditioning, you'd crush it next time. Sullivan gently took her hand, his massive claws dwarfing her arm, and shook it with terrifying precision to avoid breaking her wrist. Suddenly, the sterile white lights of the medical bay snapped off. A blaring staccato klaxon echoed through the ship. The emergency strobes washed the room in harsh crimson. Director Hayes burst through the medical bay doors, his uniform slightly disheveled. He ignored the recovering recruits and marched straight toward Abigail. "Recruit Lawson." "Dr. Pierce," Hayes barked. "We have a situation. A Priority 1 distress signal just overrode our comms array." "Director, this is a training vessel," Pierce countered, stepping forward. "We aren't a rapid response unit. We are the only ship in the sector." Hayes snapped. 10 minutes ago, a terrorist faction known as the Kalen Syndicate boarded Oasis Station. It's a deep space tritium refinement facility leased by Chevron Aerospace. They've taken 30 scientists hostage and barricaded themselves in the Central Command Core. Abigail slid off the exam table, her fatigue instantly replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. "What's the play, Director?" Hayes looked at her grimly. "Oasis Station is built on a high-density asteroid. Crystender gravity is usually stabilized by artificial dampeners. The Syndicate sabotaged the dampeners to fortify their position. The station's core is currently operating at 2 GS. My standard strike teams can't even walk through the airlock without their internal organs rupturing." He paused, looking at the biometric readings still hovering above Abigail's empty cot. "They also ruptured the primary coolant lines. The atmosphere is leaking heavy methane and ambient temperatures have plummeted to -20 degrees C. It is a literal death zone for any coalition species." Abigail began lacing up her tactical boots. "Sounds like the Crucible." "Worse." Hayes said the Syndicate mercenaries are using heavy mechanized exosuits to survive the gravity. They are heavily armed, entrenched, and they have threatened to vent the hostages into space if their demands aren't met in exactly 1 hour. Abigail stood up, grabbing her jacket. She looked at Hayes, her brown eyes completely devoid of fear. "Get me a drop pod, Director, and get me a gun." The drop pod plummeted through the void of space like a burning spear, slamming into the external docking ring of Oasis Station with a violent metal-rending crunch. Inside the pod, Abigail took a deep breath. She was clad in standard-issue Vanguard tactical armor, a lightweight Kevlar weave composite that offered minimal ballistic protection but didn't restrict her mobility. In her hands was a weapon she had specifically requested from the ship's armory, an HK-90 Orbital, a customized kinetic rifle manufactured by Heckler & Co.'s Off-World division. It fired depleted uranium slugs rather than plasma, relying on sheer brutal physics rather than thermal energy. "Lawson, do you read me?" Director Hayes' voice crackled over her earpiece. "Copy, Director. I'm in the airlock," Abby replied, slamming her fist against the manual override switch. "The atmospheric sensors in your sector are redlining," Hayes warned. "Gravity is at 2.2. The cold is dropping fast. The hostages are in the primary control room 3 decks down. You are completely on your own. Understood. Moving." The inner airlock doors hissed open. The moment Abby stepped onto the station's deck, the 2GS slammed into her like a physical blow. She staggered, dropping to one knee as her body suddenly weighed over 300 lb. The air was thick, freezing cold, and smelled heavily of industrial methane and ozone. Her heart instantly spiked to 140 beats per minute, pumping furiously to push blood up to her brain against the crushing gravity. "Breathe in for 3, out for 2, she reminded herself, clenching her jaw. Her skeleton groaned, but it held. Her dense muscle fibers contracted, fighting the invisible weight. Slowly, agonizingly, she pushed herself up from the floor. She locked her rifle to her shoulder and began moving down the dimly lit corridor. She didn't move fast. She moved with a terrifying, methodical rhythm. 2 decks down in the primary control room, Kalen's syndicate commander Vex stood in his massive hydraulic exosuit. He was an insectoid species, frail outside his armor, but inside the rig he was a walking tank. He stared at the terrified hostages huddled in the corner. "Sir," one of his mercenaries hissed over the local comms. "The perimeter sensors just tripped at airlock 4. Someone boarded the station." Vex scoffed, his mandibles clicking. "Impossible. The gravity dampeners are offline. Any Vanguard shock troop would be a localized smear on the floor right now. Check the cameras." The mercenary tapped a console. The grainy security feed flared to life. There, walking down the freezing methane-filled corridor, was a lone bipedal figure. It wasn't wearing an exosuit. It was just walking, stepping over the ruptured pipes and frozen condensation as if the crushing gravity of the station were merely a mild inconvenience. What is that?" the mercenary whispered. "It's a primate," Vex sneered, though a flicker of unease crossed his mind. "A human. I've heard of them." Soft-skinned water bags. Send a squad to the ventilation junction. Kill it. 3 syndicate mercs, heavily encased in bulky exosuits, lumbered down the corridor to intercept. Their suits winded in protest under the 2.2 GS. Their movements sluggish and heavy. Abigail heard them coming long before she saw them. The hydraulic servos of their suits echoed through the metal hallways. She didn't try to outrun them. Instead, she vaulted up onto a cluster of overhead industrial pipes, her muscles screaming in protest as she pulled her tripled body weight upward. She braced herself in the shadows of the ceiling just as the 3 mercenaries stomped into the junction below. "Where did she go?" one of them grunted, scanning the empty hallway. Abigail dropped. Using the 2.2 GS to her absolute advantage, she fell like a meteor. She landed directly on the back of the lead mercenary, the sheer kinetic force of her boots shattering the primary hydraulic manifold on his spine. The suit locked up instantly, sending the alien crashing to the deck. Before the other 2 could even turn their heavy, cumbersome weapons, Abigail brought her HK-90 up and fired. Crack, crack. 2 depleted uranium slugs tore through the weak points in their chest plating, bypassing the energy shields that were designed to stop plasma, not high-velocity solid mass. Both mercenaries dropped dead. Abigail rolled off the palm. Rally's lead, gasping for air. The gravity was tearing at her endurance. Her vision blurred at the edges, a sign of oxygen deprivation. She reached to her belt and pulled a small auto-injector of epinephrine provided by Dr. Pierce. She jammed it into her thigh. Fire flooded her veins. Her pupils dilated. The pain faded into the background, replaced by the primal apex predator focus of a species that refused to die. She pushed forward. 10 minutes later, the reinforced doors of the primary control room were blown off their hinges by a shaped C4 charge. The smoke hadn't even cleared before Abigail stepped through the breach. Vex roared in fury, raising the dual plasma cannons mounted on his exosuit. "Die, flesh thing." He opened fire, sending scorching bolts of blue plasma tearing through the room. Abigail dove, sliding behind a heavy titanium server rack. The heat of the plasma scorched the air just inches above her head. "You can't hide," Vex taunted, heavy metal footsteps thudding as he advanced. "The gravity is killing you. Your heart will explode." Abigail checked her rifle. Empty. She dropped it. She looked up at the ceiling. Directly above Vex was the primary manual override wheel for the station's gravity dampeners. It was a massive industrial steel valve currently locked in place by a heavy maintenance chain. Abigail didn't have a weapon, but she had physics and she had adrenaline. She lunged from cover, not away from Vex, but directly toward him. Vex tried to track her, but the heavy exosuit was too slow against a creature that evolved to dodge the horns of charging rhinos. Abigail slid beneath his firing arc, grabbed the hydraulic cabling on his leg, and used it to launch herself upward. She grabbed the heavy maintenance chain wrapped around the ceiling valve. "What are you doing?" Vex shouted, trying to aim his cannons up. Abigail didn't answer. She wrapped the chain around her forearm, planted her boots against the ceiling bulkhead, and pulled. It was a feat of hysterical strength. the biological phenomenon where a human brain completely disables the body's safety limiters in a life-or-death crisis. At 2.2 gs, the chain required nearly 0.000 pounds of force to break. Abigail screamed, her muscles tearing, her tendons straining to the absolute breaking point. With a deafening snap, the chain broke. She grabbed the massive steel wheel and spun it. Instantly, the station's gravity dampeners engaged. The crushing 2.2 g weight vanished, instantly normalizing to 0.8 gs. For Abigail, it felt like flying. For Vex, whose exosuit was currently outputting maximum hydraulic force to combat the heavy gravity, it was catastrophic. The sudden lack of resistance caused the suit's internal compensators to violently overcorrect. The mechanical legs kicked upward with enough force to shatter the alien's own chassis. The suit collapsed inward, trapping Vex in a crushed metal coffin. The control room fell silent, save for the hum of the re-engaged life support systems. Abigail dropped from the ceiling, landing lightly on her feet. She was covered in sweat, oil, and frost. She looked over at the 30 terrified scientists huddled in the corner. "Hi," Abby panted, wiping a streak of grease from her cheek. "I'm with the Vanguard. The extraction shuttles are on their way." 3 hours later, Abigail was back on the Aegis Vanguard. She was sitting in the mess hall, her left arm heavily bandaged, a plate of synthesized meat and potatoes in front of her. She was eating with singular, terrifying focus. Director Hayes walked into the room, followed closely by Overseer Mitchell and Sullivan. The room fell entirely silent. Hayes stepped up to her table. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy silver pin, the official insignia of the Coalition Vanguard. He placed it gently on the table next to her plate. In the history of the Coalition, no recruit has ever bypassed the training academy directly into active field command, Hayes said quietly. But then again, we have never recruited from Earth. Sullivan stepped forward, towering over the table. "When I recover, Commander Lawson, I request to be assigned to your squad. I wish to learn the ways of the pursuit predator." Abigail swallowed a bite of potatoes, looked at the silver pin, and then up at the towering alien warlord. "Sure thing, big guy," she smiled. "But you're carrying the heavy ammo on the next drop." Humanity had arrived, and the galaxy would never be the same. If you enjoyed witnessing humanity show the galaxy what true resilience looks like, make sure to hit that like button right now. Share this epic story with your fellow sci-fi fans, and subscribe to the channel with notifications turned on so you never miss our daily HFY content. What kind of extremely hostile alien world should Abigail conquer next? Drop your best ideas in the comments below, and we will see you in the next